Every open-world game hands you a map and a quest log, but Elden Ring gave none of that, and its community filled the silence with rules nobody wrote, built from thousands of strangers landing on the same instinct alone. Before we get into the first rule, if you're new here, this channel goes deep on From Software lore and community culture every single week. So if any of this sounds like your kind of thing, subscribing costs nothing and helps more than you'd think. One quick note before we start. I made a deliberate choice to leave out most of the specific build recommendations and item locations you'll find repeated in other videos on this topic, since this one is meant to be about the culture itself, the habits and instincts, rather than a checklist. So if you came here expecting a strict tier list of things to do, this is going to feel a little different by design. The first rule concerns the messages. Every Tarnished knows the messages exist. Most Tarnished have been burned by them at least once. And there's a very simple, unwritten law that governs how you're supposed to treat them. You read them, you laugh, and you do not trust them. Not fully. Not blindly. A message telling you there's a hidden path off a ledge is statistically more likely to be a lie engineered to send you plummeting to your death than it is a genuine tip. And the reason this rule exists isn't because players are cruel. It's because From Software trained an entire generation of players to distrust their own eyes long before Elden Ring ever came out. Every fake wall in Dark Souls, every illusory floor in Bloodborne, every invisible bridge in Sekiro built the instinct that the environment lies to you constantly, and the community simply absorbed that instinct and turned it into a weapon against each other. The unwritten rule isn't ignore messages, because plenty of them are genuinely useful. It's treat every message as a coin flip and never let your guard down, and Tarnished who forget this rule usually only forget it once. What almost nobody talks about, and this is the part of the rule most players never learn even after hundreds of hours, is what happens after you read a message. You get given a choice, appraise it as good or appraise it as bad. And the overwhelming instinct is to treat this like a Reddit upvote system, a way of rewarding good messages and punishing bad ones. Except that's not really what's happening under the hood. When a message you left gets appraised, whether it's rated good or bad, you receive a burst of healing back in your own game, and this happens completely independent of what you're doing at the time, meaning it can trigger mid-boss fight, mid-duel, in the middle of falling off a cliff you didn't see coming. The unwritten rule buried inside the rule is this. Appraising messages isn't just etiquette. It's a form of long-distance first aid you're performing on strangers you will never meet, and strangers are performing it on you constantly without either side ever knowing. There's a story that circulates in the community about a player fighting Rykard, trapped in the middle of getting swallowed and slammed against the arena floor over and over, who survived the exchange purely because one of their messages got appraised at exactly the right moment, and the healing pulled them back from the brink. Nobody planned that. Nobody coordinated it. It's just what happens when thousands of Tarnished quietly rate each other's notes throughout the day, and there's something strangely moving about the idea that your survival in this brutal, lonely game can hinge on a complete stranger deciding your joke about swinging at a wall was funny enough to deserve a thumbs up. This is why the unwritten rule has a second half almost nobody follows. You're supposed to appraise every message you read, good or bad, because either rating sends healing back to the author, and refusing to rate a message at all is the only way to actually deny someone that boost. Most players don't know this. Most players think leaving a bad message unrated is a form of punishment, when in reality the only punishment is silence itself, scrolling past without pressing the button. If you've been selectively ignoring messages you found unfunny or unhelpful, you've technically been starving strangers of health this entire time without realizing you had that power, and once you learn that, you can't really unlearn it. It recolors the entire messaging system from a shitposting playground into something closer to a mutual aid network, built entirely out of jokes about swinging at walls. The messages themselves have another layer most players discover by accident. From Software built them to glow, to hover slightly off the ground, and to catch the light in a very particular way. And the community figured out early that this presentation makes messages resemble items from a distance, especially in dim lighting or behind clutter. What started as a quirk of the UI became a deliberate prank convention. Place a message somewhere an item would logically be hidden, phrase it like a treasure tip, and watch players sprint toward what they think is loot only to find a joke waiting for them. This is why the unwritten rule has evolved past simple message reading into full-blown environmental awareness, because in Elden Ring, the glowing thing in the corner of your eye might be gold, might be a weapon that changes your build forever, or it might just be some Tarnished having the time of their life pretending it's the former. You develop a second sense for this over enough hours, a kind of pattern recognition that lets you tell real item glow from message glow before you've even gotten close enough to read it. And there's a strange pride that comes with realizing you've built that instinct without ever consciously trying to. Bloodstains carry their own unwritten rule, and this one is quieter, less discussed, but arguably more important than the message system itself. When you see a bloodstain on the ground, you are looking at the exact spot another Tarnished died, and interacting with it plays back their final moments as a ghostly replay. The obvious use is curiosity, watching a stranger get folded in half by an enemy you haven't encountered yet. But the real unwritten rule is that bloodstains function as a warning system more reliable than any message could ever be, because a bloodstain can't lie. It cannot be faked, it cannot be staged as a troll, it is simply proof that someone somewhere died right where you're standing. A dense cluster of bloodstains near a ledge, a doorway, or an unassuming patch of grass is the community's most trusted signal that something is about to go horribly wrong, and any Tarnished who's played long enough learns to read blood clusters the way sailors read cloud formations, as quiet, undeniable proof that danger is close. The unwritten rule is simple. Messages you weigh with suspicion, but bloodstains you take as gospel, because grief, unlike humor, doesn't come with an ulterior motive. And another quiet detail appears when you look at the game's turtles, and notice how differently the community treats them compared to everything else roaming the lands between. There's a phrase that's become so embedded in the community's vocabulary that most players say it without remembering where it came from, and that phrase is praise dog. It started as a message template, a simple pre-written line meant to celebrate almost anything, and it found its most beloved home hovering near the game's turtles, those slow, deliberate, priest hat wearing creatures that wander certain corners of the map, doing nothing threatening whatsoever. The unwritten rule that emerged from this is that you don't just tolerate these turtles, you actively seek them out to leave a message praising them, an entirely voluntary act of worship toward an animal that offers you nothing in return except its continued, dignified existence. Ask any longtime Tarnished why the turtles get this treatment, and you'll get a shrug followed by total certainty, because nobody quite knows how it started. Only that once you've seen enough messages calling these creatures wise and worthy of praise, you start to believe it yourself, and eventually you're the one crouched by a turtle, opening your own message menu, adding to the pile. Underneath all of this sits a much older, much less specific unwritten rule, one that predates Elden Ring entirely and traces back through every Soulsborne title From Software has made. You do not consult a guide on your first playthrough. This isn't written anywhere in the game's tutorial, there's no pop-up warning you against it. But the community treats it with something close to religious weight, because a guide doesn't just tell you where to go, it flattens the specific personal terror of turning a corner and having no idea what's about to happen. Messages can lie to you, bloodstains can warn you, but a guide removes the uncertainty entirely. And the unwritten rule holds that removing uncertainty on your first run is a kind of self-inflicted spoiler, one that costs you the exact experience everyone else in the community is still chasing on their own subsequent playthroughs. You're allowed to look things up on your second run, your third, your 10th, once you've earned the right by surviving the first blind. But that first journey through the lands between is supposed to be yours alone, messy and confused and occasionally humiliating, because that's the version of the story every Tarnished who came before you also lived through. There's one more layer to the message system worth understanding, because it explains why so many of these notes read as bizarre nonsense to newcomers rather than actual advice. From Software never let players type freely, instead building messages entirely out of a fixed bank of pre-selected words and short phrase templates, a restriction originally meant to prevent harassment and keep the system family friendly. What the community did instead was treat that restriction as a creative puzzle, mining the word list for anything that could be recombined into a joke, an innuendo, or a piece of absurdist non sequitur, and certain combinations became so widely copied that they've achieved something close to legendary status. Repeated across every From Software title since, instantly recognizable to any veteran Tarnished the moment the first few words appear. The unwritten rule that grew out of this isn't really about writing your own version, most players never bother. It's about recognizing the classics on sight, understanding instantly that a particular arrangement of otherwise innocent words is doing something else entirely, and appreciating the sheer commitment of a community that took a deliberately restrictive, sanitized messaging tool and turned it into one of gaming's longest-running inside jokes purely through repetition and creative persistence. What ties every rule in this chapter together is the idea that Elden Ring's community built its own nervous system out of leftover scraps the game handed them almost as an afterthought. Messages were meant for cooperation, bloodstains were meant for warning, and yet somehow both systems mutated into something stranger and more communal than From Software likely intended. A network of strangers quietly healing each other, warning each other, and occasionally praising a turtle together without ever exchanging a single word. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that a game this punishing, this deliberately isolating in its storytelling, ended up producing one of gaming's most oddly tender player cultures almost entirely by accident. If the first chapter was about the quiet, cooperative side of Elden Ring's community, this next one is about the opposite instinct entirely. The part of the player base that invades your world specifically to kill you, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, this violent corner of the game has developed the most rigid, most sincerely observed code of honor in the entire community. The first rule of dueling is the bow, or sometimes the wave, and it's the single most universally recognized gesture in all of Elden Ring's player culture. When two Tarnished meet through the game's duel system, activated by stepping onto a specific summoning sign that marks a fair one-on-one fight rather than a chaotic invasion, the expectation is immediate and unspoken. You gesture to your opponent before either of you swings a single weapon. It can be a bow, it can be a wave, it can be any gesture that signals recognition rather than aggression, and the moment either side breaks that silence with an attack before the gesture exchange completes, the entire fight is recontextualized. It stops being a duel and becomes, in the eyes of the community, an ambush, a violation severe enough that the attacker forfeits any claim to having fought honorably regardless of the outcome. What's strange, if you step back and actually look at it, is that nothing in the game's mechanics requires this. There's no in-game penalty coded into Elden Ring for skipping the bow, no achievement tied to it, no stat boost for observing it. The entire practice survives purely because thousands of strangers who will never speak to each other, who communicate exclusively through gestures and combat, have all independently decided that this moment of stillness before violence matters enough to protect. Healing is where the code gets stricter, and where the community's sense of honor becomes almost paradoxically self-punishing. During a duel, using a flask of Crimson Tears, the item that restores your health, is considered close to unforgivable. The logic isn't really about balance, since both players typically have flasks available to them. It's about the shape of the story a duel is supposed to tell. A duel is meant to be a clean measurement of two players' skill against each other in that exact moment, using the exact resources they walked in with, and topping off your health mid-fight is treated as smuggling in a version of yourself that didn't actually earn the win. Tarnished who get caught chugging a flask mid-duel don't usually get punished by rule or mechanic. They get punished by reputation, by their opponent immediately treating the fight as void, sometimes disengaging entirely rather than finishing a duel they now consider meaningless. There's an odd purity to this, a community that could easily let itself off the hook, choosing instead to hold on to a harder, less forgiving standard purely because it makes the wins mean something. Here's where things get genuinely strange though, because the no healing rule has an exception, and the exception reveals something almost tender about how seriously this community protects the sanctity of a fair fight. Elden Ring's world doesn't pause just because two players have entered a private duel with each other, and it's entirely possible for a third Tarnished to invade the host's world mid-duel, uninvited, disrupting what was supposed to be a clean one-on-one. When this happens, the unwritten rule isn't to keep fighting each other while chaos erupts around you, it's the opposite. Both duelists are expected to immediately stop attacking each other, turn on the intruder together, and treat the interruption as a shared problem, rather than an opportunity to catch your opponent off guard. Once the intruder has been dealt with and removed from the world, both players are then permitted, expected even, to heal fully back to max health, before resuming their original duel exactly where it left off. This is the single sanctioned moment where flasks are allowed mid-duel, and it exists purely because the community decided that an outside disruption shouldn't be allowed to corrupt the purity of the original fight, even if fixing that corruption means temporarily breaking the very rule designed to protect it. It's a rule about protecting a rule, a strange, self-aware bit of etiquette that only makes sense once you understand how much this community actually cares about the fairness of these fights, even when nobody's watching and nothing forces them to care at all. Losing gracefully carries its own weight, and this is where you start to see the community's honor code separate itself sharply from ordinary competitive gaming culture. Quitting out, meaning forcibly closing the application or severing your connection the moment a duel starts going badly for you, is treated as one of the most cowardly acts a Tarnished can commit. It denies your opponent the win they were fighting for, it erases the outcome from existing at all, and it does so purely to protect your own record from ever having to acknowledge a loss. The community's disdain for this runs deep enough that quitting out has become a kind of shorthand insult, a way of accusing someone of valuing their ego over the basic decency of finishing what they started. Losing with dignity, staying in the fight until its natural conclusion even when you know you're beaten, taking the death and moving on, is treated as more honorable than never losing at all, because the entire premise of dueling only works if both sides trust that the other is willing to actually see the fight through. Victory has its own accompanying gesture, and it mirrors the bow that opened the duel in the first place. When a fight ends and one Tarnished stands over the other's corpse, the community expects some form of acknowledgement, whether that's a bow of respect toward the player who just lost, a wave, or one of several other gestures that signal the fight is over and no ill will remains. Silence after a kill, walking away without any gesture at all, reads as cold, almost dismissive of the effort your opponent just put into fighting you. And while it's not treated with the same weight as skipping the opening bow or healing mid-fight, it's still noted, still slightly frowned upon, still considered a small crack in an otherwise complete code of conduct. There's something almost ceremonial about the whole exchange when you watch it play out in full. Two strangers bow, they fight to genuine defeat, and then the winner bows again, and neither player will likely ever cross paths with the other again in their entire lives. Yet for that brief span of minutes, an entire structure of mutual respect gets built and honored purely because both sides agreed, without ever exchanging a word, that it mattered. Mods occupy a special place of contempt within this code, treated with a hostility that goes beyond simple rule breaking into something closer to community-wide betrayal. Using mods that alter your stats, your damage output, or your resource management during any online interaction, especially a duel, is considered one of the few genuinely unforgivable acts in the entire Unwritten rulebook. The reasoning connects directly back to everything else in this chapter. Dueling only means something because both players are trusting that they're facing an opponent operating under the same constraints they are, and a mod user shatters that trust completely, retroactively poisoning not just the fight they're currently in, but the credibility of every fight they claim to have won. Unlike quitting out, which is viewed as cowardice, or skipping a bow, which is viewed as rudeness, mod use in PvP is viewed as something closer to theft, taking a win that was never earned and never could have been. There's a specific phrase that circulates through invasion culture with such frequency, it's basically become a genre of its own, and that phrase is level vigor, referring to the stat that governs your character's maximum health. Invaders, entering other players' worlds specifically to fight them uninvited, developed a running observation over the course of the game's life that a huge number of hosts wander into dangerous territory with shockingly little health, sometimes barely enough to survive 2 solid hits from a mid-game weapon. And rather than treating this quietly, the community turned it into an entire meme. A shared, half-exasperated, half-affectionate saw repeated constantly across forums and comment sections. Level your vigor. What makes this genuinely funny rather than purely mocking is how earnestly it gets repeated. Threads pop up regularly where an invader describes one-shotting host after host with laughably low health totals, only for the replies to split into 2 camps that never quite resolve. One insisting that low health is a legitimate build choice for players skilled enough to simply never get hit. The other insisting that no amount of skill excuses walking into PvP is fragile as glass. Neither side ever fully wins the argument, and that's sort of the point. Because the phrase itself has stopped being genuine advice half the time and started being pure ritual, something invaders say almost reflexively after a particularly lopsided kill. Less an insult and more a kind of exhausted ceremonial sigh the community collectively lets out every time the same story repeats itself. What makes all of this worth pausing on is how none of it was ever actually necessary. Elden Ring's PvP would function identically, mechanically speaking, whether players bowed to each other or not, whether they healed mid-duel or didn't, whether they quit out in frustration or saw every fight through to its conclusion. From Software built a combat system, and the community built a religion on top of it, an entire moral architecture governing violence between strangers, enforced by nothing but shared expectation and the quiet social pressure of knowing that somewhere, another Tarnished is watching how you conduct yourself and deciding, based purely on that. whether you deserve to be treated as an equal or dismissed as someone who never understood what any of this was actually for. Not every unwritten rule in Elden Ring's community survives contact with reality, and this next chapter is about the ones that actually broke. The moments where the community's own code turned against itself hard enough that players started openly telling each other to ignore it. Somewhere early in Elden Ring's life, a strange consensus formed around the idea that using spirit ashes, the summonable companions that fight alongside you in boss encounters, or leaning on the game's most powerful weapons and spells, made you less of a real Tarnished. This wasn't official, wasn't stated anywhere by the developers. It was purely a current that ran through comment sections and forum threads, an implication that the true way to experience Elden Ring was stripped down, self-imposed. Difficult by choice rather than difficult by design. Players who summoned help for a hard boss would sometimes get met with a kind of quiet condescension, not outright mockery necessarily, but a sense that they'd taken the easy road, that their victory counted for slightly less than one earned solo. The unwritten rule, if you can call it that, was closer to a suspicion, and it hardened over time into something the community mostly accepted without ever really interrogating whether it made sense. What's worth sitting with here is that this rule was never actually universal, and treating it as though it were misses something important about how this community actually functions. Plenty of Tarnished pushed back against it from the very beginning, pointing out the obvious tension at the heart of the whole idea, that everyone spent the same $60 on the same copy of the game and nobody has the standing to tell another player how they're allowed to enjoy something they paid for with their own money. Spirit ashes aren't a cheat code smuggled in from outside the game. They're a fully designed, fully intentional system that From Software built into Elden Ring on purpose, tested, balanced, and shipped as a legitimate way to engage with the world's toughest fights. Gatekeeping around their use was always, even at its peak, a minority position dressed up as consensus, loud enough in certain corners of the community to feel like a rule but never actually agreed upon by the player base as a whole. And that tension between the loud gatekeepers and the much larger quiet majority who just wanted to enjoy the game their own way sat there, mostly unresolved, for years. Then the expansion happened and something remarkable occurred, something that doesn't happen often in gaming communities. The unwritten rule didn't just get challenged, it got publicly, enthusiastically reversed by a huge portion of the exact players who'd helped enforce it in the first place. Shadow of the Erdtree arrived with a reputation for brutal difficulty even by Elden Ring standards, difficult enough that veteran players who'd beaten every boss in the base game solo, who'd built entire identities around never touching a summon, found themselves genuinely struggling. And in that struggle, something shifted. Instead of doubling down on the old suspicion towards summons, large parts of the community started actively encouraging each other to abandon it, posting openly about using the Mimic Tear, a summon that creates a full copy of your own character to fight beside you, previously one of the most stigmatized tools in the entire game, precisely because it felt like the least earned form of help available. Players who'd have quietly judged a Mimic Tier user a year earlier were now recommending it in the comments of other people's posts, framing it not as a last resort, but as a completely reasonable way to enjoy new content that was, by wide agreement, tuned harder than anything that came before it. This reversal tells you something important about how these unwritten rules actually function, which is that they were never really about morality in the first place. They were about difficulty calibration disguised as morality. The base game's rule against summons persisted because the base game, difficult as it was, remained beatable solo by a dedicated enough player, which meant the suspicion towards summons could exist as an aspirational standard without ever becoming cruel or unreasonable. The expansion broke that calibration. Suddenly, a huge number of players who considered themselves highly skilled were hitting walls that summons meaningfully helped them clear. And rather than the community doubling down and shaming those players into suffering through it solo, the standard adjusted almost overnight, because it turns out the rule was always secondary to actually having fun, not the other way around. When the fun stopped, the rules stopped mattering. Sitting alongside the Mimic Tier reversal was the introduction of Scadutree fragments, a new collectible unique to the expansion that permanently boosts your damage output and defense, specifically within the new region, stacking higher the more you find. Here again the community split. And here again the split resolved in favor of practicality over pride. Some players treated fully collecting every fragment before touching a single boss as the only correct approach, front-loading your power before testing yourself against anything serious. Others pushed forward into fights underleveled on purpose, treating being outmatched as the whole point. The genuine Soulsborne experience of getting your teeth kicked in until you learn the pattern well enough to win anyway. Neither approach ever fully won out as the singular correct way to play, and that lack of resolution is itself telling, because it suggests the community, when actually pressed by real difficulty, rather than performing toughness for an audience, mostly reverted to just doing whatever helped them enjoy the game. Rules be damned. There's one specific unwritten rule tangled up in all of this that deserves its own attention, because it involves one of the very first real threats the base game puts in front of you, the Tree Sentinel, an armored knight on horseback that patrols the road just outside the game's opening area, positioned deliberately early enough that most new players stumble into his sightline within their first 20 minutes of the game. From Software clearly intended this encounter as a lesson, an early signal that the lands between doesn't scale to your level, that you're meant to explore first and return later once you're actually equipped to win. And yet the overwhelming, almost universal instinct among first-time players is to ignore that lesson completely, to lock eyes with an obviously overtuned mounted knight and charge in anyway, die, respawn, and charge in again, sometimes for a dozen attempts before finally accepting defeat and walking away to explore like the game intended all along. This has become such a defining, near-mandatory part of the Elden Ring introduction that veteran players will sometimes describe a first playthrough as incomplete if you didn't at least attempt the Tree Sentinel unprepared, because the ritual isn't really about winning. It's about experiencing the specific, humbling shock of Soulsborne difficulty for the first time in exactly the way the game was. Designed to deliver it, stubbornly, repeatedly, and without a single ounce of good judgment involved. And yet, right alongside all this suspicion towards summons, the community somehow also built its single most beloved legend around a player who did nothing but summon himself into other people's fights, which tells you the rule was always more complicated than a simple stance against getting help. The legend in question involves Millennia, Blade of Miquella, an optional late-game boss widely regarded as the single hardest fight From Software has ever shipped, fast enough to punish any hesitation, equipped with an attack that heals her off the damage she deals to you, and capable of entering a second phase that can end an unprepared run in a single unbroken combo. Somewhere in the early weeks after launch, a player began placing his summon sign specifically outside her fog gate, offering himself up to total strangers for the sole purpose of fighting her on their behalf, dressed in nothing but a jar worn as a helmet and no armor whatsoever, wielding two katanas that stacked bleed fast enough to bring her down before her healing attack could ever matter. The unwritten rule that formed around this player, now known across the entire community simply as "let me solo her," wasn't really a rule about summoning at all. It was a rule about what to do once you'd summoned him specifically. You step back, you watch, and you do not, under any circumstances, help. This is worth sitting with, because it inverts everything the earlier gatekeeping instinct assumed about what makes a victory count. Ordinarily, summoning help for a boss was treated, at least by the loudest corners of the community, as diluting your own accomplishment, but somehow this exact same community collectively decided that summoning "let me solo her" specifically was different, was almost sacred. Precisely because what you were witnessing wasn't your own victory being cheapened, it was someone else's mastery being performed in front of you for free. Reports of his exploits spread until they stopped sounding like ordinary multiplayer stories and started sounding like folklore. A player who, by his own account, has fought Millennia somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 7,000 times, who logged over 1,000 hours, largely in service of a fight he'd already conquered more times than most players will ever attempt it. The community responded the way communities respond to genuine legend, with fan art, with a 3-dimensional printed figure of his jar-helmeted character, and eventually with a fan-made mod that turned him directly into a summonable spirit ash inside the game itself, meaning you can now mechanically call upon the legend of a real player as though he were always part of the world's design. The unwritten rule protecting his fights carries real weight specifically because of what it represents about how this community actually values effort. Interrupting his fight, attacking Millennia yourself while he's mid-combo, wasn't just rude, it was treated as robbing both him and the host of the exact thing they'd shown up to witness. A display of skill built from thousands of repetitions that no ordinary Tarnished could replicate on demand. You were expected to sit, to watch, to appreciate what was, in effect, a completely free performance from someone who owed you nothing and gained nothing material from giving it anyway. Even the story around him has picked up small embellishments over time, playful rather than cruel. including a widely shared post claiming Millennia had finally scored a confirmed win against him after years of one-sided defeats, a joke the community passed around with genuine delight specifically because the idea of the undefeated legend finally losing once felt, after everything, like it belonged in the story too. There's a second, smaller piece of community mythology worth mentioning here because it sits right alongside this same instinct toward larger-than-life meaning, and this one comes directly from an insult one of the game's own characters throws at you before you've done anything at all. Early in the game, a character named Var informs your Tarnished that you are, in his words, maidenless, referring to the fact that you haven't yet been paired with a finger maiden, the guide figure who lets you spend runes and level up in the first place. Mechanically, it's just an early tutorial nudge disguised as dialogue, but the community seized on the word itself with an enthusiasm nobody could have predicted, turning maidenless into one of the single most common insults thrown around in comment sections, stream chats, and casual conversation about the game. A jab that's since drifted so far from its original meaning that it barely has anything to do with in-game guidance anymore, and mostly just means you've been outplayed, outclassed, or generally humbled by something. The unwritten rule here isn't really a rule of conduct so much as a rule of language, an agreement that this specific word belongs to Elden Ring's culture now, deployable anywhere, understood instantly by anyone who's spent real time in the lands between. A shared vocabulary built entirely out of one throwaway line a background character says to you within your first hour of playing. What connects the Mimic Tier reversal, the Skidoo Tree split, the Tree Sentinel ritual, and the mythology built around a man in a jar helmet is a pattern worth naming directly. This community's rules were never really written in stone, no matter how confidently they got enforced in the moment. They were closer to a rough consensus about what made a difficult game still feel earned, and the second that consensus stopped serving the actual point, which was always enjoying an incredibly hard, incredibly rewarding game, the community adjusted without much ceremony, sometimes reversing an old suspicion entirely, sometimes building an entirely new legend around the exact kind of help it used to look down on. There's something almost reassuring in that, honestly, the idea that even a fan base this obsessed with earning its victories the hard way still knows when to let itself off the hook, still knows the difference between a tradition worth protecting and a tradition that's just become an obstacle to actually having a good time, and still knows, somehow, when a stranger in his underwear deserves to be treated like a legend rather than an intrusion. There's a category of unwritten rule that doesn't come from combat, doesn't come from PvP honor, doesn't come from difficulty at all, and this last chapter is about those. The small, almost superstitious habits that have nothing to do with survival and everything to do with who this community has quietly decided it wants to be. Somewhere in the lands between, scattered across specific regions, you'll come across turtles, slow, unbothered, wearing what looks unmistakably like a small priest's hat, and they do not attack you, do not flee from you, do not react to your presence at all beyond a kind of patient indifference. Nothing about the game mechanically rewards you for leaving them alone. There's no hidden item for sparing them, no achievement, no stat bonus, nothing. And yet the unwritten rule protecting these turtles is treated with a seriousness that rivals almost anything else in this entire list. A genuine, near-universal agreement that harming one of these creatures crosses a line the rest of the game's violence never does. Ask why, and you mostly get a shrug, followed immediately by total conviction that the rule is correct regardless of the shrug. Somewhere along the way, this community decided these particular turtles represented something worth protecting, some small, undefined dignity in a world made almost entirely of monsters trying to kill you, and once that belief took hold, it never really left. You'll see messages left near them entirely unprompted, players stopping mid-exploration just to acknowledge one exists, a strange little pilgrimage nobody organized and everybody somehow participates in anyway. Dogs receive a similar, though slightly different, form of protection, one rooted less in reverence and more in a kind of collective guilt. As you ride through the world on Torrent, your spectral steed, it's entirely possible, almost inevitable really, to accidentally clip a dog while galloping past, and the unwritten rule here isn't really about never doing it, since accidents happen constantly. It's about how you're expected to feel afterward. There's an assumed shared remorse the community holds toward these animals specifically, distinct from the total indifference shown towards, say, the various giant rats or ravens scattered throughout the world. Dogs occupy a strange, protected emotional category purely because they resemble something from outside the game entirely, something familiar and undeserving of the chaos happening around them, and killing one, even by accident, tends to produce a small, disproportionate pang of guilt that players openly admit to feeling and rarely bother trying to explain. One of the stranger habits that's calcified into near ritual status involves the game's fake walls, and what makes this particular rule interesting is that it survives almost entirely on inherited instinct rather than current evidence. From software included dramatically fewer illusory walls in Elden Ring compared to earlier Soulsborne titles, a fact most experienced players are fully aware of, and yet the habit of walking up to any oddly textured, slightly too clean section of wall and swinging a weapon at it persists completely undiminished. You'll catch yourself doing it in areas you've already fully explored, in games where you already know with total certainty that nothing is hidden there. The unwritten rule isn't really a rule about walls at all when you look closely at it. It's a rule about carrying scar tissue from an entire genre forward into a game that doesn't fully justify it anymore. A kind of inherited paranoia the community refuses to let go of, purely because letting go of it would mean admitting the danger, real or imagined, is finally over. There's a smaller, stranger phenomenon that lives right alongside the formal bow before a duel etiquette covered earlier. One that has nothing to do with rules and everything to do with instinct, and it shows up most clearly in the game's gesture system, the same menu Tarnished used to bow or wave before a fight. Every so often, two complete strangers will cross paths in PvP, freeze for a moment the way opponents do before an honorable duel, and instead of drawing weapons, both will independently select the exact same gesture at the exact same time, arms raised in an identical pose of shared recognition, neither side having communicated anything beforehand beyond simply standing still and reading the moment the same way. Clips of this circulate constantly. Two strangers performing what looks like spontaneous, perfectly synchronized worship toward each other in the middle of a game built almost entirely around violence. And there's no rule forcing this to happen. No reward for it mechanically, just two players independently deciding, in real time, that this particular encounter called for stillness instead of a sword. The unwritten rule buried in moments like this isn't written anywhere because it can't be. It's closer to a shared reflex than an actual law. Proof that this community's sense of occasion runs deep enough that total strangers can read the same unspoken cue and answer it identically without either one planning to. The community has become similarly gentle, in a different and slightly more mischievous way, toward its own most legendary players, and one of the clearest signs of this shows up in the small, joking asides that appear whenever someone new to the community accidentally interrupts a boss fight already claimed by one of these legends. It's become something close to an in-joke at this point that certain names once summoned simply aren't meant to be helped or interfered with, and newcomers who don't yet know this occasionally get gently, sometimes not so gently, informed by the rest of the party that they've stumbled into hallowed ground without realizing it. There's rarely real anger in these exchanges, more a kind of communal eye roll, an assumption that everyone will eventually learn which names carry that weight, and that until they do, a little good-natured correction from strangers who already know the rule is simply part of how the community teaches its own folklore to the players still catching up. There's an entire named tradition sitting underneath a lot of this that deserves its own attention, because unlike most of the habits in this chapter, this one actually has a title the community agreed on, and that title is Fashion Souls. The idea traces back through every From Software title before Elden Ring, and it boils down to a simple, mostly unspoken priority ranking. How your character looks matters at least as much as how well your armor actually protects you, sometimes more, and entire dedicated forums exist purely for players to share screenshots of outfit combinations they've assembled from mismatched armor pieces that happen to look incredible together, despite offering wildly inconsistent stat benefits. You'll see Tarnished recreating characters from entirely different franchises using nothing but Elden Ring's own item pool, piecing together a passable Kratos or a convincing Ghostface, purely through creative combination, sacrificing real defensive value for the sake of a silhouette that reads correctly from across the map. The unwritten rule here carries a specific, almost paradoxical piece of wisdom that gets repeated constantly. A sufficiently skilled player can beat the entire game essentially naked, using nothing but their own reflexes, which means armor was never really the safety net newer players assume it is, and once you internalize that, the entire logic of prioritizing appearance over protection stops looking reckless and starts looking like the natural conclusion of a game that rewards skill over gear more than almost any other genre out there. It's a rule built on vanity, technically, but vanity earned through genuine mastery, and the community treats a truly excellent fashion build with the same respect it reserves for a genuinely difficult boss kill, because both, in their own way, are proof that you've stopped needing the game to hold your hand. What all of these small rules share, the turtles, the dogs, the walls, the fashion, the quiet deference toward generosity, is that none of them make you better at the game. None of them help you win a fight, optimize a build, or survive an encounter you'd otherwise lose. They exist purely because this community, for all its brutal difficulty, all its punishing bosses and merciless PvP code, apparently needed somewhere to put its softness. Some small corner of the experience where the rule wasn't about survival or honor or difficulty at all, just about deciding, collectively and without any real reason, that certain things deserved gentleness anyway. And that's really the through line connecting everything in this video, from the healing hidden inside a stranger's message rating, to the bow before a duel that costs nothing and means everything, to a turtle nobody's ever required to protect. From Software built a game about being alone in an unforgiving world, and somewhere in the space between that isolation and the players actually living inside it, an entire unwritten culture grew up around filling the silence with meaning nobody asked for and nobody could have predicted. Rules that exist for no better reason than because enough people, separately and without any coordination at all, decided they should.